Thank you very much. It's a little awe-inspiring and frightening to give a talk in this context, but I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the audience. So I want to say right away, so that you can leave in case this disappoints you, that I'm not going to answer that question. And that's because I'm not a futurist, I'm a scientist. And I don't believe actually in making predictions about the future. I believe in making the future happen. And that's what I try and do with my work. So I'm going to tell you how AI can help us better understand social interaction, how AI can create systems that evoke natural social interaction from people in an increasingly technological world, and how AI can be made in such a way as to remain a cornerstone, how AI can be made in such a way as to ensure, not to ensure because we don't know that, but to create a cornerstone for human-human interaction as the future, as we move towards the future. But before I look at the future, or the present for that matter, I want to talk a little bit about the past. And a friend of mine sent this to me, and it's a lovely reminder of the course of our feelings about new technology. So it always starts with hope, all the wonderful things that a technology is going to do for us. So television sets are going to raise grades at school and improve family life. And you know, all of you, what happened then. It was going to destroy grades and destroy family life. And so it is with AI. Just a few years ago, we were all thrilled at all the things that were going to come about because of artificial intelligence. And now we're all terrified about all the things that are going to come about because of artificial intelligence. And when I started thinking about this, it occurred to me that this kind of discourse is really prevalent, and we shouldn't forget it. I started looking through newspapers. This is the first one's a letter to the editor. My child has murder on the mind. It's because of those horrible things. I know it is. The second is a booklet actually put out by the US government about how to deal with your children. There are a few things to practice not doing. Don't be afraid of it. These things are probably here to stay. Don't be afraid of your child. He's not here to stay. He's a precious visitor. Do not wind your child up and set him to play with it unguided. Do not wind it up and set it to watch your child. A machine is a bad soul companion. It needs help. You can help it. Love your child. Now, you can probably guess rhetorically that that first quote is about radio programs, and that the second quote is about television. So the fears that we have about new technology, and Alan Kay has famously said that new technology is any technology developed after our teen years. So our fears about new technology are nothing new. In fact, I have another quote that I'm not going to share with you from a priest about the dangers of the printing press on religion. So this really isn't something new. But I think this is my favorite article about fears about young people in particular. And my work doesn't just concentrate on young people and social AI. I also look at adults, but I've chosen to concentrate today on the aspects of my work that deal with children for the sake of débat. So this is an article that's about a father who got really carried away with finding out that his daughter was meeting a man online, and actually headed to this young woman's assignation, which he found out about, with a gun, aiming to kill both the young man and his daughter. And so this was a girl whose father ran a newspaper stand in Brooklyn, and he got this thing to help him process electronic orders, but it was new technology to him. He asked his daughter to help him, and of course, she began using it to meet people. Well, to make a long story short, this was published in 1886. Oops, and it was about the telegraph, which didn't quite land where it was supposed to. And the article was actually titled Wired Love. So this really should remind us that when we think about fears about technology, it may not be fears about the technology, but about young people. And I've written about the basis of that fear, in my mind, being a moral panic about the agency of young people, in particular young women, sexual agency particularly, but all kinds of agency, whereby it's not okay to have the world be able to enter the doors of your home without your knowing who's coming in. And I think that's really the basis of this kind of fear. And when we look at adults, a lot of what I see about AI seems to me to be more a moral panic about who we have become rather than what technology has become. Have we become people capable of great evil, such that we may use technology to do the world harm rather than good? So my own research program in the midst of all of that is a program that I've been carrying out since I was a graduate student in linguistics and psychology, and that is to better understand how we work and play and learn using both. And in case you wondered, I have to stand away from a microphone because my own nonverbal behavior is a little over the top. I got thrown out of a restaurant for stabbing someone with a fork at the next table. I was trying to explain Niagara Falls, and the fork flipped over my plate, flew across the room, landed in his shirt, and I was thrown out of the restaurant. I was 16, and clearly the path forward was to study this kind of thing. Anyway, so my own research has started out as the study of the relationship between verbal and nonverbal behavior in people and what it tells us about the mind and about mental representation and cognition. And increasingly, I've been interested in the social aspects of the relationship between verbal and nonverbal behavior. That is what's sometimes called joint action, a la Herb Clark and others, where our interaction is more than the sum of its parts, and there are phenomena that can only be described as a function of the dyad or the multi-party. And how do we understand that? And what is it good for? So how do we better understand it, and what can it do? And in my own case, I'm interested in understanding these behaviors as a good social scientist, and in using this new tool that I have at my disposal to build interventions that can make the world better, and that can specifically support us in working, playing, and learning in the world. There's also a couple of chips I have on my shoulder that I pursue. One is the goal of AI has long been autonomy, because AI started out with the Macy lectures to build machines that thought and acted like humans do in the 1950s. And that led us to an era that launched an era where autonomy, like humans, was our goal. But we're not autonomous, we're deeply interdependent. And so if I do my job well, one day we will no longer say that our goal is autonomy of machines, but interdependence, and that we are no longer replacing humans with machines, but building machines that can work in tight interdependence with people. And then finally, it really pisses me off. I said this earlier, and I said I was going to find a nicer phrase this evening, and I couldn't. So pisses me off when computer scientists and engineers and any other people talk about human behavior as a soft skill or easy, or as my students at MIT used to say before I had taught there for a while, that it was common sense. It's not common sense. And if we think about theoretical elegance, for me, theoretical elegance in my work that goes across boundaries is to account for data in human interaction with elegant theories that present common sense as something that's not easy at all to understand. And I think that's an important goal for anyone who works across engineering and the social sciences. So what do I mean by as I said in the beginning, using AI to understand human behavior. If we don't know whether it spells the end of social interaction, what does it mean to use it to better understand social interaction? And I'm going to start with an example just to kind of grab you, and then we'll talk about this example very, very briefly. I'm not going to talk about this study at length, although I'm happy to answer questions about it. And then we'll go on to some studies more in depth.
Can you raise think it has to be low because if it has to, because what do you think? Is it going to be higher or low?
Well, maybe we should make it lower so it has less room to wiggle around.
You took my idea, Alex. That was my idea because I
Nuh-uh.
Yes, it was.
So this is clearly a child terrified of a piece of technology. This was not a technology invented after this child's teenage years. And over the 25 years that I've been studying children interacting with technology of this sort, I've gotten asked over and over, and no, I've gotten told over and over and over again that I was destroying childhood. In fact, the very first time I presented a virtual child, someone stood up in the audience and said, "You are evil." Really famous professor of computer graphics. And my first thought was, well, at least he didn't say mediocre. I was pre-tenure. I thought, mediocre is far worse than good or evil. So I felt okay. But that's been said over and over again about the work I do. And in fact, a film crew came once and they said, well, are you teaching children to be robots? Are they no longer going to know what real social interaction is? Are they going to want to spend their time with perfect virtual children? And so we did a short study with children trying to find out whether they knew that these were machines and not real children. And we got from every single child exactly the same answer. So are these children? Are they real children? Are they alive? No. So that seemed like a pretty convincing answer. And since then, that was 20 years ago, since then we get uniformly the same answer over and over again. So parents are still worried, as they were 25 years ago, that children are not going to know the difference. And children uniformly think this is yet another stupid trait of their parents. So this particular study, where this child is so comfortable with this piece of technology, was a study to look at the impact of dialect on children's learning. And we would have done this with real children, except the IRB wouldn't let us put electrodes in real children's brains in such a way as to control what they said. And so we had to, it's a joke. That was, geez, you guys don't take the cue. So we had to use AI to study this. We really can't find a natural situation where we can control children's use of dialect. And here what we did was we had two conditions. We had one condition where the virtual child spoke mainstream American English throughout the interaction, and a second condition where the virtual child brainstormed with the real child in African American vernacular English, and then said, my teacher likes it when I use my school English. Let's practice our presentation for the teacher. Actually, both conditions said that, but in one condition it was mainstream throughout, and the other it was vernacular throughout. And what we found was that in working with the bidialectal agent, children showed an increase in the use of science discourse by the end of this experiment. But interestingly, that result was mediated by the child's felt rapport with that agent. So we use a technique called thin slice analysis developed by Nalini Ambady, a social psychologist who died tragically young fairly recently. And we have naive people annotate each of these videos for rapport, divided into 30-second slices and randomized. And so those that showed rapport, which were those where the agent was bidialectal, resulted in more science discourse. So this is the kind of thing you can do without installing, I'll give you another cue so you can do this right, without installing electrodes in children's brains. Now, rapport. Why rapport? Well, rapport is particularly interesting to me in part because of this dyadicity. It is intrinsically dyadic. You can't study the rapport of one person. And I'm interested in these phenomena that are larger than the unit of a person. They're also important, they're social interaction, but they've been shown to be extremely important in task performance. And it's a lot easier to get funding for task performance than for social interaction. And the kinds of task performance that they've been shown to be powerful for are things as broad as and as diverse as education, survey interviewing. Survey interviewing is particularly interesting because there's a slice where it's good. That is, if there's rapport, people are more willing to see an interview through to the end. But if there's too much rapport, interviewees are likely to answer what they think the interviewer wants them to answer. And so there has to be rapport, but not too much rapport, which is kind of fun. Physicians who build rapport with their patients enroll more patients in trials. And of course, sales. We all know that people are always trying to build rapport with us. The other day, I hate it when people say we when it's not we. And actually, Betty, you had to suffer through this. I really can't stand it, and I have to point it out to wait staff in restaurants that they are not eating with me. And so are we enjoying our dessert is not a way to describe the situation. And 2 nights ago, a waitress did this, and I said, you're a nice person. We've built rapport, so I can tell you, I really hate it when people do that, because it's not we, it's the exclusive we. And that's not we, that's I. And the woman said, but they tell us to do that. That's one of the ways they tell us we're going to get better tips. Oh, of course. So this building rapport is something that we both do naturally and that we're taught how to do. And my students and I spent 6 months following a real estate agent around because they sell you the single most expensive thing you'll ever buy in your life. And they're very good at building rapport. And I knew that this particular one was because she sold me a house I couldn't afford. And so in following her around, we were able to predict with very high precision exactly where the rapport landed. It landed at what Goffman and others have called face-threatening junctures. That is, before asking you a question like, how much do you earn, the real estate agent would make what seemed like a discursive dead end into, so when do you expect the baby? But would then cleanly slide back into, so the baby's due in March and you need the house before then. And she now knows she has them in a noose, that she can sell them any house she wants, and it doesn't matter what the price is because they only have 2 months to move. So these junctures of rapport building, of trust building, are in fact rule governed, even though they seem like common sense. That's the only time I'm going to say that, but it's really important. So that's great. And there's a lot of social science research on this. But why would we possibly want computers to build rapport? Well, in the history of natural language processing, there's a lot of work on people doing tasks collaboratively. For example, Barbara Gross did an early study on people putting together a flywheel. And it turns out that a fair amount of the data was thrown out because it was irrelevant. It was just the social chit-chat. And this seemed like a challenge to my students and I. And we were able to get our hands on a data set from a graduate of Carnegie Mellon who had also thrown out a lot of chit-chat before doing the analysis of peer tutoring for her dissertation. And we wondered whether we could better predict the children's performance on algebra if we included the stuff that had been thrown out. And in fact, we could. It turned out that by analyzing the irrelevant social chit-chat, we could better predict what dyads we're going to learn. So we do this naturally and with one another. And if we're going to collaborate with computers, which we increasingly do, then they should also be able to do this thing that improves our task performance. Likewise, we now live with a phone and spend more hours with that phone than with any other entity in our lives. And we spend time with it over a lifetime. perhaps not the same one. If we're lucky and we have enough money, we're buying an iPhone every 6 months, or at least that's what Apple would like to think. And companies like Alexa are making, in case you don't know this, you should know this, are making a concerted effort to move Alexa onto every platform, which means from your phone onto your laptop, onto the front of your refrigerator, onto the wall of your home, so that you are continually accompanied by an agent who, of course, has no other goals but to make you feel good. But if you believe that, I also have a bridge to sell you. So computers then need to know if they're going to be effective, and if they're going to be effective at our goals as well as their own goals, how to engage not just in propositional behavior, that is conveying information, not just in interactional behavior, that is managing conversation and interaction, but also in social behavior, that is managing this goal that we always have, whatever our other goals are, and that is to build a relationship with the person next to us. And if you don't believe that, stand in a bus stop sometime and ask yourself why the people around you are talking about the weather when they could really just shut up and read their newspapers. We are built in such a way that gossip and social interaction are a part of who we are. But because of my background in the social sciences, I build systems capable of social interaction in a different way than many computer scientists do. That is, rather than, not to cast aspersions on computer scientists, but rather than sitting in my armchair and reflecting on what social interaction is, I actually look at social interaction in great detail. So I start by thinking about areas of human behavior that are understudied, in particular these days, social interaction that's understudied, and in what ways models of those behaviors are missing because we don't have the tools to study them or enough data to study them, and so forth. So most recently, as I said, I've been looking at rapport. I look at hundreds, my students and I look at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of people interacting in situations that are as ecologically valid as we can make them and still collect data well. And then rather than going directly across this circle to the technology, which a number of computer scientists do, they collect data from a couple of people and then translate it into a computer system. We go by way of a model and increasingly a baby theory that explains that behavior and that is predictive, not descriptive. That is, we know when we finish this model that given X behavior, Y behavior is more likely to happen. And it's that model that gives rise to the algorithms that we implement in systems. And in case this all seems incredibly abstract, I'm going to show you examples over and over and over again, because that's the best way to learn things, or so the virtual peers tell me. And then we evaluate them. And evaluation in this particular context is really hard because these are end-to-end systems. And I know this in the most visceral way. Last night I was in my hotel room and I called up a video I had asked one of my students to send me, and something was broken in the technology when they ran the video, when my students made this video for me. And so the virtual agent was standing there like this, saying, wow, I like that too. And we cannot not interpret. This is how we're built. We interpret every behavior. And so we interpret this as a comment on what the person is saying or the agent is saying. So those evaluations need to have well-functioning technology all the way through their pipeline in order to see what's going on. And what always happens is we discover that we've ignored some essential part of human behavior, and we need to go back, which is good because then I have a job for a long time to come. So I've observed many, many situations over many, many years. I've looked at children playing with other children. I've compared children playing with children to children playing with their parents. I've looked at graduate students discussing their research, a lot of work on maps and direction giving, work on shifting topics where we were able to show that massive shifts, not massive shifts, but larger shifts in the torso accompany shifts in topic. So with my students, what we like when things go well is to be able to publish papers that demonstrate something about social behavior that hasn't been known before, like shifts in hips. accompany topic shifts, and then use that to build a system that turns out to have a positive effect on an interaction between a human and computer. It doesn't always work that way, but that's our goal. In the middle is my real estate agent, Diane, with a hapless young couple expecting a baby, and it's a girl, and so forth. So many, many different kinds of situations. And I'm going to give you 2 examples. This is data that we collected a year ago on peer tutoring of linear algebra. And linear algebra is nice because it's got a variety of different aspects of learning to it. We can do a pretest and a post-test. We can look at particular problems. We can look at how many problems were attempted, how many problems were correctly solved. It's got a lot of details that allow us to do rigorous work. And the way we set this up was to not really mislead, but to say to these kids, you're going to be working over Skype. We've got to set things up. Just hang out while we set things up. And what we wanted to see was how they interacted. And then we gave them problem sets. They worked on them together. Then we said, okay, hang on, we'll come back. So they interacted again. Then child B tutored child A, so they switched roles. And then at the end, they interacted a little bit while we wrapped everything up. So I'm going to show you 2 examples here. And this is the first one.
Our school, as part of our math program, we do the Keystones just before high school. So
Nice.
we don't have to deal with it then, just
Yeah.
now.
It's good to get off your chest, you know.
Factoring polynomials is really the only thing that I've lost after that time.
Yeah.
And overall, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, it makes sense to me, but it doesn't seem like you would use it that much. As
Yeah, I
opposed
could
to geometry and algebra, where a lot more common. But factoring polynomials, that's all like stuff that doesn't really tangible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there like a verb for tangibleness? Tangate? Things don't tanginate?
I have no clue.
So would you say they have high rapport? You're laughing. Does that mean no? They do not have. You just have to listen to the end of this.
We're out of conversation topics then.
Would you look at that? Great.
Yep.
He said, we're out of conversation topics then. And the other kid says, well, look at that. So I find this painful to watch. I don't know about you. That kid is trying so hard to make this work. And they just do not demonstrate rapport. So in case you thought there was no phenomenon that we might call rapport, and in case you thought that only people who know each other well have rapport or don't have rapport, this is a really tangating example of rapport between strangers or the lack of rapport between strangers. So let me show you, whoops, the next one.
Like 1 minute, it's like the easiest thing ever, like those graphs, and then like,
Just like small multiplication, division stuff.
yeah, and then all of a sudden it's like,
Letters.
letters, variables, you know.
Yeah, and I don't really understand most of it.
I mean, I understand this stuff, which is on my paper right now. I mean, I get that, but, there's just like this weird transition in like the middle of algebra, like from algebra half to algebra 1. That is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
And, you know, sometimes it's really stressful for me, you know?
Uh-huh. Like, don't like math.
Don't like math.
Yeah.
I mean, the only kid who likes math in my class, his name is Jacob. And he basically obsesses almost over every subject, so I just shouldn't talk about him.
Oh.
Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Any difference with that first video? Yeah, so likewise, strangers, they've never seen each other before. And the kinds of things that you're seeing, and I try and make a really concrete distinction between what you see and what you interpret. What leads you to interpret this as rapport is things like increased movement of the body, increased smiles, more mutual gaze, more self-disclosure, that is talking about things about themselves, more what's called entrainment, coming to talk like the other person. Their speech gets closer and closer to the same speech rate, and so forth. So we can interpret behavior in the person across from us or in two people that we see as showing rapport or not showing rapport. Whoops, me.
Oh,
Move forward. So we analyze this stuff. We actually analyze it at very tiny granularity, at 1/30th of a second. We look at every eyebrow raise and eye blink and head nod and look away and movement of the hands and self-disclosure and praise. There's no praise, by the way, amongst teens of this age. I think we have maybe 300 videos, 300 hours of video, and I believe that there are 2 instances of praise. So we look at it in very fine granularity, and increasingly, because I've been doing this for a long time, we use machine learning to do some of this work. So we do data mining. This is sequence mining to be able to predict an outcome event like a learning gain through the input events such as rapport or mutual gaze or whatever it happens to be. And we use something called temporal association rules using an algorithm called TTARL that Ran Zhao, one of my PhD students, turned into a real-time system so that we could use it in an agent. But this allows us to find out really cool stuff. I mean, hundreds and thousands of these rules get spit out, so I've chosen one that's comprehensible. But if the tutor, whoever happens to be the tutor then, smiles, and then the tutee teases the tutor, and then the tutor smiles, and the tutee, SV is, I think it's self-disclosure, discloses something, then rapport is rising. So these are the kinds of things these rules allow you to see, and it allows us to understand social behavior in a way that's very hard to do by eye, because this can look at those 300 hours of video and pull out of them hundreds and thousands of rules and then group them and then use those groupings of rules as input into a theory and then also as a part of an algorithm. Now, the input into a theory looks something like this. This comes from a massive walk through the literature, prior literature in social psychology, cognitive psychology, education, sociology, ethnomethodology, and many other fields by Ran Zhao, PhD student, and it allows us to see the kinds of mid-steps that there are between behavior and rapport, and to turn it into a process model that's much closer than that's to something that drives an agent. So I said that we first build a model and then we implement, and these are some of the implementations my students and I have done over the years, and you can tell it's a long time because in the upper left-hand corner is the first real estate agent, which ran on 4 or 5 networked computers, of which one was a Silicon Graphics reality engine, and now it runs on 1 laptop. And in the lower left is a newer version of the real estate agent, much prettier. So the implementation architectures like this involve some modules that we had to develop ourselves. And that's what's interesting to us, is that we take the human behavior and we develop modules that computer scientists wouldn't otherwise develop for a natural language architecture. And here, the really interesting ones are a conversational strategy classifier that takes incoming language and can automatically, with high precision, high accuracy, say whether it's a self-disclosure, praise, a question to elicit self-disclosure, a violation of social norms, a following of social norms, and so forth. And that's input into a module called a rapport estimator that every 30 seconds assesses the rapport, not in the person, but between the person and the agent, using data from both person and agent in the same way we do when there are 2 people. And the data from that, which is a number between 1 and 7, rapport is going up, rapport is going down, goes into a module called a social reasoner, which, unlike the reasoners that you usually find in natural language systems, is able to reason about what next social thing to say in order to improve rapport, keep rapport steady. We could break it, but we tend not to do that. So I'm going to show you an example of an implementation. I'll show you two pieces because I showed you two social pieces. This is the part where the kid and the agent, and this agent was built on the basis of the data you saw about the two kids. This agent is first hanging out with the kid, and then I'll show you a task portion.
Hi, I'm Jaden. What's your name? I'm Sasha. It's nice to meet you. You as well. So what school do you go to? I go to Ellis. Oh, cool. I go to Pa Cyber School. Cool. What grades are you in? I'm in 7th. Cool, me too. Cool. What do you do for fun? I like to draw. What about you? I like playing robot soccer.
We have fun in my lab. You can see, you can see this girl engaging, in reciprocal self-disclosure. She's asking questions to elicit self-disclosure. I don't know what that's doing there. Interesting. There we go. She's doing the same kinds of things the kids with high rapport did amongst themselves. And here's a part of the tutoring session, and you're going to see the impact of that social on the tutoring.
Nope, that's not quite right. Don't worry, I think these are hard too. Okay. +9. Oh, 50. Yeah, I think that's right. So what do you think you should do next? I will divide by 10 and that'll get me x equals 5. Correct, I'm such a good teacher. Okay, let's go to the...
So you get a sense of what's going on here, and once again, you see the reaction on the part of the child who's drawn in by this self-disclosure, negative self-disclosure, which works really well with teens. We had a kid say, I used to have pets, but then I killed them, and my mom won't let me have any more. We never really got to the bottom of that. That negative self-disclosure, I'm bad at this too, is really evocative for kids of this age. So you get a sense of why this tutoring works as well as it does. And then we evaluate, and I told you evaluation is hard, and so we use many, many kinds of evaluation metrics, the thin slice rapport score, and so forth. And I just want to give you a quick example or two of some experiments from start to finish. One is an experiment, it's not really experiment because it starts out with ethnography and then a study and then an experiment and then an implementation and then another experiment, but a research program that we're currently working on curiosity. And everyone's talking today, the next generation skills that children are supposed to learn in school include curiosity. But to cut to the chase, you don't find curiosity in every school, and particularly in under-resourced schools where resources such as funding for the school are dependent on test scores. There's a teach-to-the-test environment, which means that really curiosity is systematically being killed off, especially in those schools, but in many schools. And the first thing we did was an ethnography in 3 contexts: a school context, an after-school program, and our lab. And to my postdoc's shock, I said, we're not going to look at the school or the after-school program. We're not going to find out anything about curiosity there. The teacher had the kids pick up a rock, and she said, smell the rock. Okay, write down what you smelled. And the kids just looked like, please, may the earth open and swallow me up. It's not curiosity in any meaningful way. And this is interesting because there's a lot of research on curiosity, on children's curiosity, from George Lowenstein, from some pretty fabulous people, but no one has looked at the social nature of curiosity or the social provokers of curiosity. It's a real research gap. And so if we're going to find children in schools where the teacher is not provoking curiosity or protecting curiosity or inspiring it, could peers do that? And that was what we went to look into. So we had kids build a Rube Goldberg machine, which they love to do. We give them pipe cleaners and paper cups and stuff like that, and ask them to build a machine that a marble can roll down. And we had 8 cameras trained on them. So we had a camera on the hole. We had a camera from the top so we could see the hands. We had a camera on each torso, and actually it's more than 8, and then a camera on each face. And we looked at a whole series of behaviors. We did a very complete, once again, annotation, and some of that annotation was done automatically. And then we did a continuous time structural equation to see whether the parts of curiosity that we had broken down actually held water, and what behaviors identified curiosity. And here are some of the behaviors that identify curiosity. So positive sentiment about the task, head pose movement, negative evaluation, surprise, and so forth. So those are the behaviors that allow us to recognize curiosity. That's important because if we want to build a system that can automatically recognize curiosity and protect it, we need to be able to recognize it. So this is the first step. And the second step is, what behavior induces curiosity? And here we found out this really amazing thing, which is that other children's behavior is a better predictor of curiosity in a target child than the child's own prior behavior. So the child's behavior at time 1, time 2, times 3, time 4, time 5, time 6 is a less good predictor of their curiosity at time 7 than the behavior of children 2 through 4 in the rest of the group. And these are the kinds of things that we found. So kids say things like, no, that's a terrible idea. That's not going to work. That's a really good predictor of curiosity. Kids get pissed, and so they look for something that's going to work. We find that the group gets curious when the kids together come up with a solution, and then they criticize that solution and try and change that solution. We find that suggestions that are verbalized as an idea and then argued with lead to curiosity. Ideas that are verbalized and then lead to a justification for that idea by somebody else also lead to curiosity. So here's all these cool things that kids are doing for other kids to evoke real curiosity and that are not being followed up on. So we looked both, of course, correlationally and causally, and these are some of the things that are causal influences. And here we used the technique from economics, Granger causality. Here are some of the causal provokers of curiosity. And I'm going to give you an example. So if the first kid says, I mean, it would be strong enough, but how would the ball roll up again? And kid 2 says, oh no, these wouldn't be strong enough. And kid 3 has an idea. I have an idea we could use 2 of these, and if we had a hard enough dip, the ball would come down. So P3's curiosity is increased from P1's idea verbalization and justification, followed by P2's negative evaluation. And this is one of these cases where, it's common sense, but it's common sense that we haven't yet explained nor used in any way, either for theorizing or for intervention. So this is the kind of thing that we're building into a virtual peer. It's got the most amazing AI challenges in it, and the extraordinary master's student, Bhargavi Paranjapi, who's been working on this, has been building things like a curiosity recognizer, an explanation machine that explains things using only the kinds of phrases that children use, doing named entity recognition, and then using those entities to do the explanation. Really an extraordinary, you can see the data for what she calls the child-centered modeling that allows her to build a machine that generates utterances like these children do. And we're still working on the part where we can automatically recognize what the child is saying. As children get younger, that's harder and harder because speech recognition doesn't do very well with squeaky high voices or voices that are changing from utterance to utterance. So the implementation then for this, and we've already begun work on this, Zhen Bai, who's the postdoc on this project, comes from a background in tangible interfaces and is interested in augmented reality. And she's been working on a way for children to play a game with the virtual child so that the virtual child is one of the players. And here we're collaborating with Jessica Hammer, who's a faculty member in the HCII and a game designer, who's developed a game that evokes hypothesis formation, and evidence adducing for those hypotheses. And that's what we're using as the way for the virtual peer to play with the child. So next, we're going to look at group curiosity more than the sum of dyads or the sum of individual children. How do we look at the gestalt of curiosity in a group, and what can we do with that? And I'm just going to very, very briefly talk here because it's essential to the claim that I made at the beginning that AI can form a venue for the use of social interaction. And this is work that I did quite some time ago now, around 9 years ago, looking at whether AI systems of this kind, once again, virtual children, and this is not all I've done with my career. I haven't spent my whole career building virtual children, although they are easier to feed and they always go to bed when you tell them to. I've also built all kinds of different systems than this. But in this particular instance, because for a decade or so, parents would come up to me after talks and say, can I please have this software? I have a child with autism or Asperger's. I know he or she would really love this and might learn something from it. And I used to say, I'm really sorry, I don't have expertise in that. I don't want to do it unless I know what I'm doing. And then I got a graduate student who was interested in this and who did know what she was doing. And Andrea Tartaro and I did this. She did this for her PhD, and it's really very exciting work. So first, we simply looked at children who were diagnosed as having Asperger's or high-functioning autism, and we watched them play with real peers or virtual peers. And what we found was that more social skills and higher level social skills, things such as contingency, saying something relevant to what the other child said, are used in the context of interaction with a virtual child. And that's cool. And they really are striking, like parents were really blown away and teachers were blown away to see this child say, oh, you made cookies? I'm going to make cookies too. Whereas they don't expect that kind of contingent relevant behavior to occur. But we don't want children with Asperger's and high-functioning autism to be spending the rest of their lives in interaction with virtual children, not the goal. So our question was, in the same way, building these systems allows us to learn about social interaction. Could it allow children with autism and Asperger's to learn about social interaction? In particular, we developed a system called the authorable virtual peer, where we gave children the control panel for a virtual peer and asked them to control the virtual peer for a child in another room. And one child with Asperger's said to us, we said, we're kind of in a hurry, we'll do it in the same room as the kid. And she said, no. When I build a virtual thing, I like to be in a different room, which was kind of a surprise to us because we didn't know she had a history building virtual things, but apparently she did. So we asked children to author behaviors for, actually first to control the virtual peer, and then to develop new behaviors and add them to the control panel. And what they did was first they dragged and dropped buttons onto the control panel and used it. Then they watched the interaction with the other child in another room, and they were asked whether they were happy with that. And if they weren't, they could go back and change it, and then they could record segments, add behaviors, and so forth. And we found some changes, for sure, but more importantly, we found that we could better understand what was going on, the kinds of behaviors that may be affecting reciprocity, for example, that you saw in rapport building amongst the typical teenagers. So one kid's panel said, want to hear a scary story? Well, if you said yes, that's good. If you said no, then too bad, because I'm about to tell one. So that's a very typical Asperger's-like beginning to a story. but it's not going to invite a lot of interaction with the other child. And that kid said, after looking at the interaction, I should have used more question buttons. Can I try it again? Which is wild, because that kid realized. And there's something, teachers who work with children with autism and Asperger's have told us that there seems to be a kind of a heat, or like getting burned when children in this population have to interact with other children. That it's almost makes them freeze. And here they're being allowed to do this from a distance and to get some distance from the interaction. Now, the Holy Grail, of course, the only question that matters is, does it allow them to have a more satisfying interaction with other real children? And in fact, we did find a transfer effect. So we did a study where we had children use what's the state of the art called social stories, where children read stories that are very, very rule governed, and they're told the rules. When someone asks you a question, you should ask a question back. When someone says, how are you? The answer is, I'm fine, how are you? Some very, very kind of stimulus response behaviors. And you can see this if you've interacted with individuals who've learned social behavior in this way. So children in the same group were counterbalanced. So some learned some behaviors with the social story, and some learned and those children learned other behaviors with the virtual peer, and vice versa. So every group learned some with social stories and some by controlling and authoring the virtual peer. And lo and behold, what we found was that the children who learned those behaviors by authoring the virtual peer actually had a higher chance of transferring that learning to their interaction with other children, particularly for the social skills of reciprocity or contingency responses and giving feedback. And that was quite exciting to us. So I'm going to stop here way later than you expected, and I apologize about that. I said in the beginning I wasn't going to give an answer, and I don't know what the future is going to hold, but I do believe that we can make a future happen with AI where social interaction is preserved. I believe that can happen by using social AI to understand social interaction, by building social AI that concentrates on collaboration rather than replacement, and collaboration in a way that evokes from people and insists on people acting the way people act in this increasingly technological world, that social AI can teach social skills to those who need to learn it, and that we're creating a different kind of AI than Alexa or Siri or Google Now, and you've seen a lot of complaints on the part of parents who say that their children are less and less polite. They don't say thank you. This is an AI that may not evoke thank you. It may evoke, that's a stupid thing to say, but that is natural social behavior. And that's the goal, because that you can grow out of and turn into a future where you are actually a social person in a social world. So thank you.
So there are microphones on either side. If anybody has any questions they'd like to pose to Justine. And I see Valerie's going over.
That was really, really fascinating. What about the flip side of where you're trying to get kids not to trust online sources and stuff? Is there a sort of complement?
Yeah.
Terry, where, I mean, we generally want our kids to be trusting, but sometimes not.
Right. That's a good question. So, we teach our children stranger danger, and we don't teach our children false source danger. But it's not all that dissimilar. Who do you listen to and who do you not listen to? If someone tells you to go home with her, do you go home with just anybody? If someone says, I can make you $1 million, in 5 minutes if you fill out this questionnaire with your home address and phone number. Do you say yes? I think these are essential questions of child rearing. And that false source question, I'm not sure I have the right answer for it, because I think it's a question about education more than a question about the online world. I don't think it's all that different from being, I think, and I'm trying to do this on the fly, and I'm not sure I'm giving an adequate answer even to myself. I tend to think that it's more like learning in the classroom whose work to cite and how to cite it than it is about the online qua online. My own graduate student, not so much PhD students, but master's students still occasionally cite someone else's term paper, which blows me away. As if it's written and it's there, they should cite it. Yes, there's increased access, but there's also a question of rhetoric and evidence. And if we're doing our hypothesis testing, teaching correctly, then the nature of evidence should be something we cover, which is why I think it's more about education than the online world.
Thank you. So, hello? Okay. So, thank you very much for your talk. One of the things one might infer from some of your findings is that we should design social AI to be imperfect. That is, that the point, what would happen if in fact you no longer can distinguish the real from the agent? So there's a lot of effort, of course, to do that, right, as you know. So what do you think about the argument that a lot of this leads us to think, well, that should not be the goal, and the goal should be to design AI that is not at the end point, is always distinguishable, is separable, is a different category?
I have a bunch of answers. First of all, I have to say that the first thing, thank you. The first thing that comes to mind is a short story from the 1800s called The Sandman, which is about a young man who falls in love with an automaton. And if you haven't read up on automata, it's super interesting because they are the AIs of 2 centuries ago. And exactly the same phenomena that we're seeing with AI happened then. So this story is about so first they were amazing. They were ways to study human behavior. The Droz brothers in Switzerland built automata to understand how we write. They wrote in exactly the way we did, in the way that I build things to understand how people work. And then they became drawing room toys, and then there came fear. And this is a story about a young man who falls in love with an automaton, and his friends are worried because she's so perfect. She never sings a false note. Her piano playing is perfect. You know, everything that we prize a woman for. Her stitches are tiny. And then ultimately, he finds out to his horror that she's an automaton, and from then on, men began to prize women who sang slightly out of tune and who even spoke as if they had an opinion, which I thought was great. Uh-oh, that way danger lies. So in that sense, yes, we want imperfectness to know that something is human. There's a lot of ways, and this is the second answer, to know that. In my own work, you'll notice that none of my virtual humans are realistic. None of them are photorealistic. And that's because I have no desire to make them look like humans or even be as human-like as possible. My goal is to evoke the most human-like behaviors from the real humans, not to make an AI that is the most human. And so that's personal choice, and that's a choice I think that we all have to make for ourselves. There are going to be evil people who use technology for evil ends no matter what we do. Pencils are really good at stabbing people, and it's an old-fashioned technology. However, I think that we are not in danger in our lifetimes of seeing AIs that cannot be that can be mistaken for humans because of that photorealistic issue. That is, what's called the uncanny valley, which is a sense of dis-ease and almost fear of the kind that you would have in front of a dead body. That's how people describe it. Has often been described as being evoked by photorealistic characters, but I don't think that's the case. I think what the issue is that something that looks photorealistic, should act photorealistic, and we don't have the machinery to make its voice sound photorealistic, make its movements photorealistic, to time the movements to the speech with photorealistic accuracy. And I don't think we're going to, for at least, who's the youngest person in here, for at least another 70 or 80 years, because those are really, really big theoretical problems as well as engineering problems. Now, I talk a lot with world leaders, and the reason I talk with world leaders is they want to know whether they should regulate this. And everyone at the World Economic Forum wants to know what kind of regulation they should put in place. And I had a really fun and funny thing happen. This past year, I was invited, and I was very honored to have dinner with President Macron of France. And he had invited, I think, 8 people from the US, 3 French people who live here, 5 Americans, to come to this tiny little dinner with 17 of us in the palace in the Élysée, and to talk about AI and the future of AI. And the next day we all gave talks, and he announced his AI policy. And he said, I think we need to regulate this. And I shot up my hand over dinner and said, that's a really dumb idea. We shouldn't regulate it. We should educate it. We can't do things by regulation. We can only do things by education. If we give ethics education to engineers, I think we're less likely to have these kinds of issues. If doctors learn some machine learning and machine learning scientists learn some medicine, I think we'll do a lot better than regulating it. And he said, Dr. Cassell, I am a president. Presidents regulate. Which then I thought, oh my goodness, I just told President Macron that was a stupid idea. But he did mention it the next day, actually. He said, I will regulate, but to the extent possible, educate, in his public talk, and then winked at me, which I was so honored by. So I think in all of these things, to kind of sum that up, we can't prevent people from doing evil things. We have to keep in mind the personal choices we can make. And we're not in danger for a really long time because of the state of the technology. But during that period of time, we have to dive into education so that we don't end up with regulation. It's kind of a long answer.
That was perfect. Actually, that dovetails perfectly into my question, so that's wonderful. So I work in policy, and I'm actually on the forum on promoting children's cognitive, affective, and behavioral health here at the academies. And one of the things we've been trying to figure out is, I guess as we think about social media and children and everything, one of the major drivers, right, for the development of technology is advertising, and people at the various companies trying to optimize the amount of time you're spending on things and click-through rates and all of that. And so I was trying to understand, I'm sure educate and not regulate is a big part of it, but the economics of getting from here to there, because I think part of it's the fact that we envision autonomous AI, but then part of it's also just the daily grind of business and what can we do in policy science to, I guess, make sure that the economics of it go in the direction of social.
Yeah. Luckily, there are people like you thinking about this. It's a domain that I don't know a lot about, and I don't want to give you an informed opinion about something I'm absolutely uninformed about. I do think that education is what's going to make this work for us rather than regulation, because I don't think we can regulate technology building. It gets built in garages if it doesn't get built in companies and then gets sold to companies. Yeah. And I'd love to hear from people who are informed about this, what can be done and what is being done, because it's an interesting and tough problem.
I guess I'm sort of pulling on the same question, but I had written this down to myself back at the end of your talk. As this understanding progresses, isn't the same underlying technology able to help encourage children to be obedient? Or even worse, to be mean and evil to each other? Because everything here that we're talking about, and all the drivers, of course, are to help them grow out of problems or help them do things, and agents to help teaching or whatever else. But I think of the Chinese social credit scoring discussion, and the same underlying tech, maybe faster than we realize, can be used for purposes that we might not see as not so nice.
One of the reasons I love my research is that I get to see a lot of children in action. And maybe that's why I have so much more faith in children than a lot of us do. I've been asked to do interviews about Alexa and Siri a lot recently. And one of the interviews said, we're going to make little robots who act like Alexa and Siri, the interviewer said. And I was able to point out that already on the web is, I think he's a third grader who's published his kit on how to hack Alexa. And this is why I have faith in children. It's exactly the same argument I used to have. My colleague Henry Jenkins and I did a book on gender in computer games, and people used to tell us how evil Barbie was and shouldn't we regulate Barbies out of the marketplace. And I used to point out that actually Erica Rand published a book called Barbie's Queer Accessories, and she talked about a common behavior where children use Barbie's feet use Barbie's feet to scrape pastries off the top of their Easy Bake Oven. So we are lucky that children are born, as one of those quotes said, with curiosity, and they're born with creativity. And it's really some schools do everything they can to squelch that. And they don't succeed, luckily for us, because that's the kind of thing that gives me faith that no one's ever going to teach a child to be obedient and not 100% obedient. If you've figured out how to do it, you should publish that. You could make a lot of money. But I don't know anyone who has. And I don't think we ever will, and perhaps that's why I can build these technologies. And I've built a lot of technologies that are for children to construct, because being a constructor as well as a consumer is, I think, a very important goal for our children. Yes, please.
You touched on this a little bit throughout, both in jokes talking about Alexa's kind of goal isn't really necessarily to help us, it's to convince us to buy things, and the real estate agent's goal in building rapport is to sell you something, and even in the instances of looking at education, building rapport in order to improve retention of information, and you mentioned that generally always the goal is to improve rapport, although I can think of many different points in my life where I wish to reduce rapport, and we see in the the students without a particular goal, that just depending on the nature of how they're approaching the situation, you could have a situation in which the one kid is trying so hard and the other one is like, I don't want to be here, or I'd talk to you, let's just be quiet. So I think this is related to all of which is to say, related to the other questions that people had about that the goal is so important to both the study and the what we learn, and how is your thinking about the goal influence what you choose to look at, I guess.
So I'm trying to think how true to be, how accurate to be. Often, when I started as a faculty member, I was, and I continue to be, really interested in children's storytelling, natural storytelling. And often that's stories of personal experience. And I really find it fascinating because it's such a great window into children playing with the potentialities of life, what they could be, what they might want to be, all the different variants of who they want to be or could want to be or might want to be. We see that on the web as well when children play with what seems like dangerous behavior, like sexting or posting semi-nude pictures. I grew up in New York City. I did way more dangerous things than that. I don't think it's the web that brought that on. So I think we play with our experience. When I started this research with technology, I really wanted to build story listening systems because I thought that people weren't paying enough attention to these all-important stories that children had to tell. Okay, this is going to be the first part of the answer, which is really a little negative. It was impossible to get funding for. And it took me until I realized that storytelling was a good predictor of literacy, that I could finally get funding for it from the National Science Foundation. And I stood up at an NSF PI's meeting and I said, why don't you fund more stuff like this? And the program officer was trying to get me to sit down. And after the meeting, I said, what was that about? And he said, we're the NSF, we're the National Science Foundation. You're the only person we've ever funded to do storytelling research in this division. So it wasn't easy to fund. Often I start with a behavior and I may look at what it's useful for, but the behavior may be just as interesting to me qua behavior, or because I think there's something really deep to understand about human nature, about children, about the world, about how we operate as people with other people. So that's the kind of pessimistic view of things. The other view of things is that we always have goals and plans, and they're not necessarily nefarious, and they're not necessarily the kinds of goals that would scare you. They're not necessarily learning better linear algebra. They could be having a happy marriage. And rapport is really good for that. Turns out that some of this nonverbal behavior is extremely predictive of divorce. If you want to know, you can come up afterwards and I'll show you it's a single muscle that's predictive of divorce. And those are also the kinds of things we want to know. How rapport plays a role there. And most of you probably saw the article in the Times that was in Modern Love about the kinds of questions, deepening intimacy over time that you can ask one another. And it's led to lots of relationships. And this is based on very old research showing that deepening intimacy over time, that is deepening self-disclosure. It's really rapport building. It's exactly what I've been talking about today. And that's task, but the task is social. So I've chosen to show you in most of these instances, task performance, where task performance is something propositional. But in the case of children with Asperger's and high-functioning autism, the task is, for many children with autism, they are desperately lonely and depressed. Comorbidity with depression is high. And so being able to spend time with other children through being contingent, being able to be in a classroom and get the kinds of goodies that social interaction brings you in a classroom requires knowing how to do classroom. And that's a task, but it's not a task of the kind I think you're worried about.
So the bad news is, I'm going to make that the last question. The good news is that you get to talk more over wine and food on the third floor. There's a reception that we have at the atrium. You can either go up the stairs out here or take the elevator, and hopefully we can continue conversation about how AI gets us to think about things a little bit differently maybe than it has in the past. So let's thank Justine and go have some wine.